So it's a pleasure to welcome Nishant Shah to UCHRI today.
Thank you.
Nishant is the director of the Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore and the producer, director, editor, author of Digital Alternatives or Digital Alternatives with a cause.
Yeah.
So it's fabulous that you're here and joining us. And we've started a conversation about the relation between the humanities and social sciences. And so I just want to ask you how you think they weave together, or where do you think the divergences are, what fruitful conversations productively might be engaged at their interface.
Thanks, David. It is fantastic to be at UCHRI. I think this is a conversation which needs perhaps more time and also certain other kinds of histories. But let me see what I can say about how things are happening in India when we start thinking about humanities and social sciences. To begin with, I think it's a forced marriage that happened. And the forced marriage happened because of two reasons. One was that in the 90s, there was this growing buzz about interdisciplinarity. It was necessary suddenly for social sciences to find humanist values, and it was necessary for humanities to find social currency to kind of explain why we are necessary in the kind of work that we do. And so we had a lot of research organizations and universities opening up to the idea that interdisciplinarity can happen between social sciences and humanities. But in the process, we've had a very clear hierarchy which has now been established. So you have the political sciences at the top because they obviously benefit the world and account for it in a practical sort of way, right? It helps you understand economic crisis and it helps you understand how people vote. The second rung is more in terms of the social sciences which deal with identity politics. So you have feminism, Dalit political rights, queer movement, sexuality studies, and so on. But you also have sociologists, anthropologists, and stuff. And then the bottom rung has always been the humanities. People who do these foofy things with affect and with art and with liberal arts and cultural production and what we feel and things like that, right? So interdisciplinarity, at least in India, has always meant that humanities now has to tackle social sciences questions, whereas social sciences' conception of what it means to be human remains uncontested. Yeah, so that's a very peculiar kind of a crisis, which means that a lot of us who worked with liberal arts, with humanities, suddenly had to start talking in the language of social sciences, which means that questions of aspiration, of desire, of affect, of interpersonality, of emotions suddenly became less relevant. And if they became relevant, it was only so that they could address a certain language of rights-based discourse which social sciences privileged.
Right. Can you say a bit more about what you understand to be the social science conception of what it means to be human, and contrast it, say, with the conception that is threaded through the humanities?
Sure. So again, I'm only going to answer it from the specificity of India and see how the disciplines have kind of emerged. The formulation of social sciences in India, and especially the conception of human, has been enshrined in the language of rights. So what you have is like a four-pronged hierarchy of how the human needs to be established at an equitable level. Claims for justice and fights against discrimination can be established and so on, right? So within the social sciences, you have a very clear idea that the first step towards recognizing equity, or the human condition, so to speak, is one of access. It can be access to different kinds of rights, access to resources, access to different conditions of living, access to life, access to dignity. Most of these are actually enshrined in the constitution and are granted to the human, who is also the citizen subject at some point, right? However, the role of social sciences has been to unpack how access is very uneven. There are certain privileges which have been granted and there are certain who are always going to be discriminated. And so a lot of the impetus has been, especially if you look at the 60s and the 70s in India, has been about trying to fight for presence. That you need to have more different kinds of bodies, more different kinds of human beings present while we are shaping policies and laws of certain kinds. And this is really kind of being replayed in the information and communication technologies for development portfolios. So the first step is that everybody should have more access, which means the state then builds massive infrastructure, like billions and billions of dollars spent into reaching the last mile, having the digital technologies reaching that interior person who lives in the heartland of Bihar who needs to now communicate to the state using digital technologies, right? The minute that happens, you realize that, oh, well, the access has now been granted, but we don't really have now enough presence. And so we now need to try and do competence building, capacity building, skills training for certain kinds of classes who have uneven access of a certain kind. If you establish that, and that's where we were in the 80s, after that you start realizing that what is really needed is for them to be stakeholders in the policies and the infrastructure rather than just beneficiaries of it. So now you need to go and start looking at inclusion, right? That you need to be included in the very processes of being human.
Right.
That you can no longer just be a beneficiary of a humanist ideology which kind of goes into you. So how do we now do it? We do it by the simple process of affirmative action. We have quotas, we have reservations, we have special seats which are reserved for these people to be a part of that particular space. And when all of this happens, we suddenly realize that what we're really dealing with is a rights-based discourse of being human.
Right. There's a sense in which the human becomes human through its operationalization.
Absolutely.
Right?
So it is operationalization of different kinds of state apparatus and state systems, which conceptualizes the human being.
Right.
And so eventually, no matter what your disgruntlement might be, what your specificity might be, you get reduced to this idea of a right-bearing citizen as equal to a human being.
Right.
And so you will have strange kinds of rights which emerge, right? So in the early 2000s, you have the National Right to Information Act which comes out in India, which is fantastic because it gives you access to state information and makes it transparent. But it supersedes, for instance, right to food. So you might be hungry, but you will have information about why you are hungry, right? And so there is this strange
way... become hungry for information.
Information, yeah, and that's what you're supposed to do. So it's that conception of the social sciences which the humanist has been asked to now take over. And saying that you might want to talk about things which are more personal, visceral, affective, but they will have to be quantified in these terms, and they must lead to a right-based, normative human subject, which the state can then deal with.
Yeah, that's curious and interesting. And so if you flip the question and sort of ask the question about the human from the side of the humanistic, and use that as a way of critical engagement, right, and intervention in relation to the this production of the rights-bearing sort of human capacity-building kind of person, how would you see the conception of the human being conceived or played out in relation to the on the side of the humanistic?
I think the most interesting part that the humanities brought in India was not looking so much as the human itself, but the human condition. To start thinking about what are the conditions which are going to grant you a certain amount of humanity, which also coincides with the constitutional rights. It's about dignity and life and so on and so forth. But it's no longer feeding into the quantifilia that comes in also with the funding patterns in the 80s and the 90s. So that's the second sort of violence that happens onto the humanities. That even when social sciences tried to take up this looking into the human condition, and they did it quite successfully in some ways. Some fantastic work, for example, on conditions of homelessness, which doesn't just deal with the urban, just the rural poor or so on and so forth, but the urban homeless phenomenon, right? And the relationships that people have with belonging, with ownership, with possession, and so on and so forth. These things did pick up, but they were quickly subdued by the funding patterns because there was this overwhelming way by which the funders required these things to be quantified again so that an indexicality can be produced and different people could be just typed and sorted out. So I think that's where the new challenges are going to be. It's about going to say that the humanities have already, in some ways, learned how to deal with social sciences and enter into a productive way of thinking. Because of course it is interesting now that the Section 377 case, which is a case that's going on in the Supreme Court of India right now, and it's an Indian Penal Code which is against unnatural sexual acts. The decriminalization of homosexuality, which is right now being fought on the grounds of rights, is also being fought and supported by the grounds of dignity and life. So that's an interesting wedding which has happened there with humanities and social sciences, leading to production of a much better human condition. But the other way around hasn't yet happened. And I think one of the things that we need for it is for social sciences to stop thinking of the individual as a subject and the individual as a human. And that, I think, still hasn't happened. And we need to push further in that direction.
Yeah, this is really interesting, and the way in which, I mean, India's, one hesitates to say reinsertion. It's not like it was not inserted into the kind of global mix, right?
Yeah.
But it's become, a much heavier player sort of in the global mix of things, given its economic success story of the last couple of decades. Is there a way in which you see, going both ways? I mean, south to south kinds of dialogues, south to north and north to south engagements. The impact on these questions of both through the humanities and the social sciences on this question of what it means to be human.
This is something that we're kind of pushing forward in our work, but there are a couple of impeding factors. One is the fact that every time we talk about India, it's always an exceptionalism argument.
Mm-hmm.
So that no matter what you do, it's always about India, it's specific to India and then contained within it. So it's been really interesting to find certain kinds of political dissensions, different kinds of inquiries into conceptions of what it means to be human, which is global south based. And so interactions, for example, with the post-colonial movement in India and the post-colonial movement in sub-Saharan Africa has been really fruitful to have that kind of an inquiry. Because the post-colonial was that particular moment where the subject and the human became the same. Because your rights as a political subject were intrinsically linked to how you perform yourself as a human being in that particular context. But that hasn't happened with the liberalization movement. We haven't found that commonality of human condition living and so on and so forth. But the digital has been interesting in finding those points of commonalities then. Simply because so much of the digital focus has been on social networks, which is not a space where normative subjectivities are formed, which is not a space from which you can make rights of entitlement and claims.
Exactly.
It suddenly opened a new space for us to look at how people are trying to connect with each other, belong to each other, trying to find commonalities in terms of how people just feel. What are the new axes of discrimination or exclusion which might not be articulated in the state's vocabulary, but can still form new communities which are globally distributed and consolidated at the same time.
And do you, I mean, I'm happy that you brought up the digital because I wanted to raise it. I mean, the impact of the digital on these questions, both in terms of how the questions are posed and in terms of responding to them and enacting or giving them a different kind of operationalizing. Right, so it's now not just. I mean, you mentioned earlier that it was, the state using the digital to reach out, to incorporate, right, to bring into the body politic those who had not hitherto fully been incorporated. But the digital has a way of also sort of cutting across and beyond those capacities, right, and enabling, as you put it, through these network engagements, people to interact with each other that become in a way uncontrollable to some degree. So I wonder if you can talk at least in closing to some of these questions.
The digital in India has been exciting because while it has been promoted by the state to achieve certain visions of India shining and so on and so forth, the state has always had a relationship of huge anxiety with the digital. One because
for good reason.
For good reason, yeah. One because it produces acts of unbearable transgression. So that if you look at the last 10 years of public discourse, it has always been about the state's incapacity to deal with what's really happening with these technologies which were supposed to reach the interiority and build the outsourcing industry and so on and so forth. The second is the condition of obscenity. In terms that there is no longer a single moral compass or a normative state which is going to define what is happening there and be able to make sense of what are the kinds of transactions which are emerging within that, right? And therein is a lot of hope. Because the minute the people who are using these technologies escape the hegemony of the state as the only moral compass or the only normative structure through which they define themselves, they immediately start experimenting with a whole range of community belongings, mobilizations, interactions, and so on. And I think that's really fascinating to kind of just look at.
This is fantastic. So you're giving us a lot to think about. I'm almost tempted to call this the first of HRIX. And I want to thank you, and I'm sure there will be many more conversations, and we'll look to engage you more and more in our own networks of interaction. So thanks very much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
A pleasure to have you.